Eer ich heim zu reden, will ich sagen ein paar Wörter. Ich will ausdrücken einen herzigen Yasser Koyach, die euch nicht bloß für die heutige Konferenz, zu Jonathan Brent und zu allen seinen Mitarbeitern und Verwaltungsmitglieder von YIVO. Ich rede nicht bloß wie ein gewesener Exekutivdirektor von dem Institut, nur euch wie ein Kind von der Schere Saplete. Und ich will ausdrücken, a Yasher Koyach, für koidem kol für den Kiem von dem Institut, wie eine unabhängige wissenschaftliche Institution, unabhängig von Universität, unabhängig viele von Gewirr oder zwei Gewirren, Ameven Jovin. Ein Institut, was tut weiter, was das jüdische Volk darf. Ich suche dem Yasher Koyach euch zulieb die finanzielle Basis von dem heutigen YIVO, was ist ein Poel Jötze von der Arbeit von Jonathan, von Melissa und von anderen Mitarbeitern von dem Institut und von Mitgliedern von der Verwaltung. Yasher Koyach für den groß vergrößerten Eulen, was der Institut hat zugezogen in die Zeit von der Pandemie und in den Jahren nachdem. Und für die Ufde, was der Kiem von dem Institut ist nicht mehr eine Frage. Das heißt, der YIVO ist ein Jesch. Und ich meine, es ist ein Jesch nicht bloß für den Heint, nur euch für die kommende Deures. Need I translate? I wanted to express a word of appreciation and of praise to Jonathan Brent and to his colleagues at the Institute today, who his colleagues on the staff and his colleagues in the board, who have not only assured the independence of YIVO, which at various points in the last 2 decades was in question, not only in the last 2 decades, and have assured the future of the Institute, both in financial terms and in terms of the much broader worldwide constituency that they have been able to attract to YIVO in the course of the last decade or two, and most especially in the years since the COVID pandemic. The work that has made possible enriches all our lives, And I wanted to begin with a Yasher Koyach for that, and not only for this conference. Now let's begin with this session. The speakers you have in your programs, we'll begin with Professor Eric Goldstein, followed by Professor Hasia Diner and Professor Naomi Seidman. Professor Goldstein.
Thank you, Sam. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be speaking today about this small book, largely forgotten today, but it was one of the first English publications of YIVO in the 1940s. It's called The Classification of Jewish Immigrants and Its Implications, a Survey of Opinion. And here's what it looks like in hard copy. And as I said, it's largely forgotten today, but as I hope you'll see, I feel it's very historically significant. On November 8th, 1943, in the middle of World War II, Earl G. Harrison, the Commissioner of U.S. Immigration and Naturalization, issued an order that Jewish immigrants entering the United States would no longer be classified as Hebrews, a racial designation which had been used for over 4 decades in the government's immigration records, and that they would now be listed instead as part of the, quote, race or people of whatever country that they came from. Little fanfare accompanied this order. In fact, hardly anyone seemed to notice at all. There was not a single reference to it in the general press, and I could also not find any mention of it in Jewish publications. It's unclear if Commissioner Harrison consulted with Jewish leaders before making his decision, but it does not seem to have been made in response to any recent appeal. The commissioner, however, could only have imagined that Jewish leaders would be happy with his instruction. After all, organizations including B'nai B'rith and the American Jewish Committee had opposed the classification of Jewish immigrants by race ever since the practice began in 1899. And I'll just, wanted to show you, this is the list of races and peoples that was used, this one's from 1929, by the immigration officials in classifying immigrants as they arrived in the United States. The representative of these groups who opposed it was Simon Wolf, a Washington, D.C. attorney who tried to convince both immigration officials and members of Congress that Jews should not be classified in official records at all, arguing that as a religious group, they were constitutionally protected from the government inquiring into their faith. As Wolf himself admitted, though, in private correspondence, his real reason for opposing the classification of Jews as Hebrews was the fear that it might raise questions about their status as white and threaten their hope for integration into the white American mainstream. Although Wolf knew that many American Jews regularly used racial language to describe themselves, and many actually found the idea of a Jewish race to be an emotionally satisfying concept, he felt strongly that there was a particular danger in using this in government officials using this language, especially in an era when race was employed to enforce social and legal boundaries in the U.S. with renewed vigor. Wolf and the organizations he represented ultimately failed in their quest to remove the term Hebrews from official records, and to some extent their fears came true in 1924 when the Jackson-Reed Act, inspired in large part by racial nativism and the particular demonization of Eastern European, Southern European, and Asian immigrants, imposed harsh national origin quotas that brought Jewish immigration almost to a halt. As a result, Hebrews continued for decades to be included on the list of races and peoples. By 1943, however, important changes in the social position of American Jews were afoot that made Harrison's change in policy a logical move. Aided by wartime developments, Jews were finally overcoming obstacles to social integration into the white mainstream that had been fostered during the interwar years by persistent anti-Semitism. As this integration began to take hold through military service and the weakening of other social, economic, and cultural barriers, race began to lose its saliency as a term to define Jewishness. Also speeding this transition was the association of racial Jewishness with Nazi ideology, which was strongly targeted by American wartime messaging. As the racial definition of Jewishness declined in popularity, American Jews began to search for new, more appropriate terms to articulate their distinctiveness both to themselves and to the non-Jewish public. But there were also motivations internal to the Roosevelt administration and to American society that helped propel Harrison's decision to remove the classification of immigrant Jews as Hebrews. The administration's promotion of an inclusive nationalism, which opposed bigotry against European immigrants and their descendants and welcomed them into the American mainstream during the war years, was not simply a gesture of goodwill, but it was also part of a conspicuous policy to unite and strengthen the resolve of a diverse population against America's enemies. Liberal as this welcome seemed at the time, it was implicitly conditioned by the expectation that these groups would attenuate their distinctiveness and blend more seamlessly into the white native-born population, a process many members of the dominant society saw as necessary to increase the stability of American society. It is in this light that Harrison's order concerning Hebrews can be understood. Far from an isolated act, it was consistent with a series of policy changes made over time that succeeded in decoupling race from American immigration policy and replacing it with nationality as the key means by which various immigrant groups were classified. Jews were the first group to be taken off the INS's list of race and peoples because they were seen as the group most likely to inspire racist conspiracy theories about the negative impact of immigration on American society. This became a particular concern of the administration in 1942 and 43, when greater awareness of the fate of European Jewry was emerging. While the administration felt constrained in opposing the popular quota system that had kept many Jewish refugees out of the country in the 30s and 40s, Harrison's office was nonetheless supportive of aiding Jewish refugees, and he was working behind the scenes in 1943 to forestall efforts in Congress to pass even more restrictive immigration laws that would prevent them from coming to the U.S. after the war. He likely reasoned that by removing the Hebrew designation, a change that made Jewish immigrants virtually invisible in official records, except as citizens of their countries, he could undermine the expected opposition and give the government leeway to accept more Jewish refugees than would normally be possible. So here is where the unlikely role that YIVO played in responding to Harrison's order in the spring of 1944. Given Harrison's benevolent motivation in changing the classification policy toward Jewish immigrants, how surprised he must have been to receive a letter in April 1944 from officials at YIVO, most likely from its research director, Dr. Max Weinreich, expressing grave concern about the removal of the classification and asking for a detailed explanation as to why the change had been made. Although along with his fellow YIVO-associated scholars, sociologists Jacob Lashinsky and Nathan Goldberg, Weinreich argued that the removal of the classification would deprive scholars of a valuable source of data from which social scientific studies of Jews could be produced. Apparently hoping to effect a reversal of the order, but aware of the limited influence that three émigré scholars would have over such a decision, Weinreich and his colleagues decided to conduct a survey in which they would engage a broad range of prominent scholars and communal leaders, both Jewish and non-Jewish, and solicit from them opinions on the INS's action. And here you see the three scholars that we'll be talking about. Devising a questionnaire that was sent to approximately 200 individuals and sent back by about 140, the three scholars asked, and let's see, here's the actual questionnaire. One, whether it was important to have specific statistical data on Jewish immigration, or whether there was no reason, whether there was some reason to refrain from collecting it. Two, whether the respondents approved of the INS's removal of the Hebrew designation, or whether it should be restored. And three, whether the classification of Jews as a race was appropriate, or whether some other term should be used. Once the replies were received, Weinreich crafted a summary and analysis of the main points, which was published in the Yiddish language YIVO Blätter, as you see here, along with the full text of the responses, an article by Lichinsky on the necessity of having specific statistical data on Jewish immigrants, and another by Goldberg reviewing the history of the classification of Jewish immigrants. And then a year after it appearing in YIVO Blätter in 1944, the English language book was published under YIVO auspices to reach an English-speaking audience. While the survey responses were varied, the mostly American respondents did hit on a number of similar themes. First, Jews and non-Jews alike agreed that race should be banished as a term for Jews, describing this usage as unscientific, inappropriate, even dangerous. While the YIVO scholars put this question third on their questionnaire, most respondents made it the focus of their response. Many, again, both Jews and non-Jews, specified that if race was to be used in the classification of immigrants, it should only refer to differences in color between African Americans, whites, and Asians. Most respondents approved of removing the term Hebrews because they saw it as a racial designation. Those who offered an alternative typically suggested Jewish. There was agreement with the YIVO scholars that data on Jewish immigration was valuable, however. Many were leery of the government collecting data on Jews. Some suggested that immigrants have the choice of voluntarily identifying themselves, and many Jewish respondents argued that the data should be gathered privately under Jewish auspices. Whomever collected the data, most respondents agreed that in lieu of race, immigrants should be asked to identify, say, their ethnic group, cultural affiliation, or perhaps mother tongue. Having chosen the survey as a method of airing their concerns, the YIVO scholars decided to publish all the responses, which did not necessarily advance their case. However, embracing a model in which the consideration of diverse opinions was central to the scholarly process, they hoped that through interpreting the data, responding to it, and framing it with scholarly articles of their own, they could still successfully express their qualms about the INS's ruling. When reading the YIVO scholars' articles and analysis alongside the responses to the survey, a clear difference of worldview shines through. Weinreich, Lichinsky, and Goldberg approach the issue from the perspective of diaspora nationalists with backgrounds in interwar Eastern Europe who understood Jews as a culturally autonomous national group with collective rights that demanded recognition by the state, whereas the mostly American-born or acculturated respondents saw Jews as individual citizens in a voluntaristic society where Jewish identity was a private matter outside the purview of the government. Although most of the American respondents recognized the value of collecting data on Jewish immigration, the YIVO scholars emphasized the importance of Jewish inclusion in official statistics as a matter of respect and recognition for the Jews as a people. Although Lichinsky had lived in the US since 1938, his views were shaped by his past involvement with various Jewish nationalist parties and as an advocate for Jewish autonomy in interwar Ukraine. As a demographer and statistician, he was focused on making sure that Jews' role in society was properly acknowledged and contextualized, that their true qualities were recognized through the presentation of conclusive data, and that stereotypes about them were refuted. In regard to American immigration records, he argued that it would be misleading if Polish Jews were simply written down as Poles, because it would credit Poles with qualities like the tendency to remain permanently in the United States that were really more typical of Jews, and it would obscure the fact that the Jews fled Poland in large numbers owing to economic disadvantages and discrimination. It would also make invisible the high concentration of Jews in skilled work and artisanship, making it impossible to refute, quote, the anti-Semitic thesis that the country is overrun with Jews who do not possess any capital or qualifications. More galling to Lichinsky than any particular analytical outcome, however, was the general sense of disrespect implied by the state denying Jews recognition as a group worthy of inclusion in statistical analysis. Whether European Jews constitute a national or religious group is not for anyone in the United States to determine, he wrote. Considering his past work as an advocate for Jewish autonomy in Ukraine, he was especially bothered that a Ukrainian coming from any country would be recognized as a Ukrainian, while Jews would simply be listed according to their country of residence. As one of the founders of YIVO in Vilna, Max Weinreich, a native of Latvia who arrived in the US in 1940, had also been a builder of Jewish cultural and national autonomy in interwar Europe. As a linguist and advocate for Yiddish, however, his focus was more cultural and less political than Leszczynski's. For Weinreich, Jewish group distinctiveness was self-evident. Whatever ties Jews had to the larger society, it seemed to him futile to deny that they lived as a group distinguished by their language, culture, and social structure. Jewish separateness is not a question of this or that particular conduct of the Jews, he argued, but a sum total of historical facts. Given this perspective, Weinreich viewed respondents who wanted to define Jewishness in a narrow way, to keep data about Jews out of the hands of the government, or to limit the discussions of Jewish difference to private communal venues to simply be denying reality. Nathan Goldberg, who taught sociology at Yeshiva University, had been in the US longer than Leszczynski or Weinreich, having emigrated from Slonim in 1920, but he was more aligned with Weinreich and Leszczynski in his views of Jewish identity than with the American respondents. The classification of Jews under a separate heading does not seem to constitute an act of discrimination, he argued. On the contrary, failure to classify them as Jews may, in a certain sense, be regarded as an act of discrimination. Aside from these general differences in understanding between the YIVO scholars and the American respondents, they also diverged on two very specific issues. One was the meaning of race in the American context, and two was the relationship between Jewish statistics and anti-Semitism. While the YIVO scholars seem to recognize that Hitler's use of racial thinking made the term race problematic for Americans in describing Jews, they were not as bothered as the Americans by this usage, unless it was clearly intended to impute Jewish inferiority, a practice Weinreich called racialism. Leszczynski stated matter-of-factly that, quote, "The question of whether the word race is an appropriate term or should be replaced interests me less than the need for Jews to be recognized as a distinct group in government statistics." Even more significant, while the American respondents were clearly motivated by the context of the black-white divide in America and the fear that a racial description of Jews could call into question their status as white, this concern was admittedly foreign to the YIVO scholars. To be frank, wrote Weinreich, the question of color is to me a marginal issue. A similar gap in worldview was apparent in how the two groups viewed the potential that government collection of data on Jews could facilitate anti-Semitism. I do not believe that accurate information about the Jews will checkmate anti-Semitism, wrote Leszczynski, but fight against it we must with accurate information. We must argue with open and hidden foes, and each official figure carries much more weight than any obtained by private agencies. While the YIVO scholars understood the threat of anti-Semitism as one that endangered the rights and status of Jews as a people, the American respondents saw it much more as a threat to individual Jews who face barriers in their pursuit of upward mobility and integration into American society. In their view, it was preferable that the government did not ask Jews to identify themselves in official records because they wished to be able to manage their own visibility as Jews as it suited them in navigating the opportunities and pressures of American life. Nowhere was this gap in perception as obvious as in the survey's treatment of Jewish refugees. One respondent, philosopher Sidney Hook of NYU, understood the unspoken motive of Commissioner Harrison in trying to pave the way for post-war Jewish refugees by removing the Hebrew classification, agreeing that registering Jewish refugees as Poles would generate less opposition to their arrivals than registering them as Jews. Weinreich doubted that such a plan could remain under the radar, but at base, his objection to it was rooted more in an outlook that privileged Jewish group interest over individual interests. In his view, the way to help Jewish refugees gain access to the US was not by concealing their identities, but, quote, by making the average American understand that the fate of European Jews in the present war has been singular. In what other group did so many perish by cold-blooded extermination methods? Whatever the future may have in store for America regarding immigration, he wrote, these facts must become common knowledge, but informing public opinion means singling out the Jews, not hiding them under a false label. Despite these stark differences between the YIVO scholars and their American respondents, one of the most significant things about the YIVO survey of 1944 is the extent to which, in its final conclusions and proposals, it did end up reflecting a degree of coalescence between the viewpoints of the two groups. Weinreich suggested an improved questionnaire for use by the INS. One of the questions reflected not only the importance of classifying Jews as Jews, but also the Americans' concerns about the danger of a racial classification of Jewishness and their desire to define race only in terms of color. Weinreich settled on the term ethnic origin as the best way to ask if someone was Jewish, and presumably agreed that the best answer to this question would be Jewish, not Hebrew. He was not convinced that the data should be collected privately by Jewish organizations instead of by the government, but he did give a nod to the voluntaristic nature of American society by adopting the idea that each immigrant should have the rights to define their group identity in a manner of their own choosing. In considering the impact of the survey on the respondents, one of the most significant contributions of YIVO's efforts was that they pushed the Americans to appreciate the value of keeping statistics on Jews, even though the INS never did restore the separate classification. Even more important, by asking the respondents for terms other than race that could be used to define Jewish distinctiveness, the survey played an important role in creating a consensus that such terms were badly needed and helped develop a vocabulary to express this revised definition of group identity. Because this book was circulated widely and reviewed in several academic journals, it was likely an important factor in popularizing terms like ethnic group that were just starting to take hold especially among lay people during this period. Finally, in its approach of surveying and publishing a wide range of opinions from far-flung sectors of the American and American Jewish worlds, this publication opened an important conversation between individuals and institutions who had quite different opinions on Jews and Jewishness, but who signified by their participation in this project a willingness to listen and learn from one another. With this coalescence in mind, one can see this book as one of the early signs of the Americanization of YIVO, as scholars and thinkers shaped by their former homes in Eastern Europe started to struggle and reckon with the ideas and attitudes prevalent in their new home. But this process was clearly not a one-way street, as we can see how YIVO, even in its infancy as an institution headquartered on these shores, was already raising important issues and challenging the thinking of the American and American Jewish publics. Thank you.
Permit me a comment about Commissioner Earl G. Harrison. Before he became Commissioner of the Immigration and Naturalization Service, Harrison had been Dean of the University of Pennsylvania Law School. After he was Commissioner of the INS, he was asked in June of 1945 to go to visit the DP camps in Germany and Austria. He was asked by Truman to visit the DP camps in Germany and Austria because Truman had received messages from various sources complaining about the treatment of DPs and particularly of Jewish displaced persons in the DP camps. He and two other colleagues spent July of 45 touring 30 displaced persons camps in Germany and Austria. Harrison himself went to Bavaria, which was the locus of the American zone of occupation in Germany, and held the vast majority of the DP camps and the vast majority of the Jewish survivors. He and his two colleagues issued a report a month later, in August of 45, noting that Jews were indeed kept in camps, sometimes even the same concentration camps where the Nazis had kept them, were kept in camps surrounded by barbed wire and American soldiers. The difference between the treatment given by America and the treatment given by the Nazis, Harrison said, was that we don't exterminate them. The report caused a brouhaha in the United States and in Britain, in that the report called for the British government, which had the mandate over Palestine, to issue 100,000 entry certificates, visas, to Jewish displaced persons, and particularly because the report called for the treatment of Jewish displaced persons as what they were, that is, as Jews, and not as members of their various national belongings. The removal, when he was INS commissioner, the removal of the designation of Hebrews from Jews could be seen as a universalistic stance by Harrison. A year later, the call to recognize Jews as being in a particular situation, as not being able to return to Poland or the other countries from which they had come, and the need to treat them differently than their co-nationals, can be seen as a particularistic conclusion on the part of Harrison. It would be interesting to note, I don't know actually, whether Harrison had seen the YIVO publications on this matter in 1944, or whether he had seen the book that you referred to, published in 1945. I wouldn't put it past Harrison to have had someone translate the publication in 44 in Yiddish for his purposes, so that he would be aware of exactly how the YIVO scholars were reacting. And I wouldn't be surprised if that would have had some influence on Harrison to come to the very different conclusion he came to in 1945 than the one he came to in 1944. I now have the pleasure of introducing my friend, Professor Hasia Diner. You see in your programs a general description. I want to point out that she has held a Guggenheim Fellowship in 2010, and that her important studies have won the National Jewish Book Award not once but twice. In 2009, for We Remember with Reverence and Love, American Jews and the Myth of Silence After the Holocaust, and again in 2013 for the book 1929, Mapping the Jewish World. Hasia Diner has written on Italian, Irish, and Jewish foodways, on the history of Jewish women in America from colonial times to the present. I call on Hasia Diner.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking the organizers of the conference, and really was very gracious of you to invite me. So I'm going to begin very quickly with a series of questions, some of which Professor Weiser has already spoken about, and so I can do it in a less elegant and detailed way than he as I begin my talk. So how did YIVO assume its role in America? What role did it envision it for itself, and how did it change with time as the American Jewish population moved to an inexorably to an overwhelmingly Anglophone American-educated population, increasingly removed from its East European immigrant antecedents? What were the impacts of the Cold War, the Civil Rights Movement, the move of American Jews into the academy as students and faculty, the ethnic revivals of the 1970s, and I think really importantly here, the move of Jewish studies from strictly Jewish institutions, the rabbinical seminaries for the most part, as well as Yeshiva University, to the colleges and universities all across the land. How did they leave their mark upon YIVO's potential subscribers, readers, and stakeholders? Whom did YIVO view as its world, as its folk? And what were the topics that YIVO tackled to speak to the interests and concerns of those in its networks and to the larger American Jewish public, particularly those concerned with the world of letters? Now, there are many ways in which this could be done, and I want to focus in a very narrow way on publications, and particularly on the YIVO Annual. Very handy way to try to think about these topics. We know from the keynote this morning that there were several YIVO publications before the annual, which begins in 1946. There was Schriften, there was Yiddish, YIVO Blätter. These were all in Yiddish. The one had the English Yiddish counterparts, although they weren't actually perfect translations one of the other. And they were for members. That is, they were for the people who were the actual participants in YIVO. But my subject is the YIVO Annual of the Social Sciences, an American-born project, which, unlike the earlier YIVO publications, was defined as a strictly scholarly one, unlike Yiddish and Blätter, and it was aimed at an American English-reading public. It was not, other than the very first volume written exclusively for or by, most importantly, YIVO insiders. So it came out in the first full year after the end of World War II. It was a year that made it very clear there was absolutely no going back. It was the year of the Kelch pogrom. It was the official beginning of the Cold War, the year of Churchill's Iron Curtain speech at Westminster College. Demographically, it was officially marked as the beginning of the baby boom, the first year that saw the demographic explosion of the American publication. 1 year after 1946, when the YIVO Annual began, was the opening of the first Levittown, which we might symbolically see as the beginning of the post-war rush to the suburbs, a move in which young American Jewish families stood in the vanguard. And also 1946 was the first year of the functioning in New York of the Ives-Quinn Civil Rights Bill. So it was the year, it was a bill enforced by the New York State Department of Human Rights, which banned, and importantly for our purposes here, discrimination on the basis of religion in institutions of higher education, private ones in particular. So this is the more a very telegraphed context of that 1946 moment. When the YIVO Annual began, we might want to just quickly think about who some of its sort of either co-publications or competitor publications may have been. Jewish Social Studies had been founded in 1939, and the publications of the American Jewish Historical Society, which had been launched in the 1890s. 2 years after YIVO Annual was begun, American Jewish Archives began its publication. To suffice it to say that without any systematic comparison as to the readers, real and potential, as well as the subject matter of those publications vis-a-vis the YIVO Annual, can say just off the bat that AJHS Journal and that of the American Jewish Archives focused solely on America, and they were purely historical in their subject matter. And as opposed to Jewish social studies, which included a great deal of social science kind of contemporary research, the YIVO Annual would combine both the historical and the contemporary sociological or social psychology kind of material. Now, to just begin or to start thinking about the YIVO Annual, I want to look to 2 articles that were written about YIVO Annual in 1946, immediately after its first publication. Both articles appeared in Commentary, itself a product of this age. It did not, it was founded in 1945. So the first article was written by Milton Convitz, a professor of law at Cornell, and it was entitled YIVO Comes to Morningside Heights. The focus was on YIVO itself, its founding, its relocation to the United States, and not just on the newly launched journal, but Convitz offers us a way to think about the journal, its title, and its potential and its problems. The social sciences, he wrote, represent the self-consciousness of a society. Through them, a community acquires knowledge itself. As in other fields, the Jewish social sciences would follow the interests and the everyday affairs of men, okay? And I'll kind of make that gesture, because that runs through all of this, using the methods of exact measurement that distinguishes the natural sciences. Nor would they, YIVO and YIVO Annual, stop with quantitative analysis. A social science study is more than a description of events. It attempts an explanation of change. Okay, he obviously got the gender correct, okay, in terms of the subject matter of the YIVO Annual, certainly in its first couple decades. That Convitz postulated in the article that YIVO and what YIVO and the Annual could do, he considered that YIVO's concern with Yiddish, quote, as the living folk speech of the Jewish folk, is its key, quote, it's the tenet of its basic philosophy, but he postulated that that would be a problem that would retard its efforts from bearing scholarly fruit. Yiddish, he said, was all fine and good. He was no opponent of Yiddish at all, but he noted that the Jewish public, now largely resident in the United States, vast majority American-born, native English speakers, which needs to examine itself, will not be served by YIVO with its deep Yiddish focus. YIVO would not be able to, quote, minister to the self-understanding and inner strength of the Jewish group in America. He stated the question bluntly, how can a scientific institute devoted to Jewish social research that chooses Yiddish for its language be said to manifest a popular orientation if the people it works among no longer speak Yiddish? To this end, Convitz lauded 2 developments: YIVO's publication that year of Max Weinreich's Hitler's Professors, you saw the cover, in English, not a translation, from Yiddish, and the first volume of the YIVO Annual, quote, a collection of English translations of Yiddish papers just published. These 2 are, and again here, Convitz, foreshadow YIVO's development into a bilingual institution. YIVO's wisdom in moving to English for the dissemination of scholarship boded well for Convitz, and he predicted that while it will continue to hew its outstanding work in history, folklore, economics, statistics, and linguistics, it seems to, and these are now again his words, it seems to have turned to American work with great interest, and judging from the evidence in that first volume of the annual, quote, is rapidly assimilating the best American techniques. A second commentary piece in 1946, specifically on the YIVO annual, was written by Oscar Handlin, who reviewed the first issue of YIVO annual in commentary. He gave a brief but still evaluation, particularly as thinking about how the annual began that year and how it would develop, and his predictions as to how it would develop over the course of, say, the next quarter century. The Harvard-trained historian on the faculty of Harvard's history department since 1938, who would in the next decade play a pivotal role in the launching of American Jewish history as a professional entity, considered the appearance of the YIVO annual important of importance for reasons exactly what Convitz had said. Now in English, Handlin told us, American readers, quote, deprived of access by ignorance of Yiddish, could, quote, be able to learn of the products of YIVO scholarship. The annual would be profitable to the members of YIVO themselves, but for other American Jews, people whose knowledge of the language would be perforce be weaker, the annual would serve them well. Handlin then offered a quick summary of what appeared in that first original volume, assessing the articles as they fit with American conceptions of social science. He noted that the editors included linguistics as a field, generally counted as one of the humanities in the hands of Yiddish, but in the hands of Yiddish it has become a social science which mirrors the part played by Yiddish in the social life of the Jews of Eastern Europe. But in this maiden, shall we say, voyage of the YIVO annual, he noted that the articles paid no attention to political science, all perhaps because of, quote, the alienation of the Jews from the state in Eastern Europe. Hence, no articles on statecraft. Handlin also pointed out that the YIVO annual ignored economics, okay, as it is understood in the American Academy. Yes, there were articles that stress, and I use these for my quote marks here, stress economic and social factors in history, but did not concern itself with pure economics, that is, the functioning of the system of production as such. He went on to note that the annual concerned itself mostly with social psychology and history. As to the former, they are, quote, up to the level of what is being done elsewhere, but they offer no new departures. They share with the general limitations of the approach. That's Handlin, the historian, talking about social psychology. But when it came to YIVO's engagement with history, he offered much praise. In a remark that presages the much later work of Yosef Chaim Yerushalmi and Zachor, Handlin remarked how the depth of and the richness of YIVO's historical articles contrast with the general paucity of real and valuable historical scholarship in the Jewish field, something he posited as very much at odds with the millennial Jewish self-understanding of the meaning of time. More importantly, though, for thinking about YIVO and the YIVO annual, as Handlin saw it, he, the scholar who would go on to write and train so many young scholars in the field of social history, YIVO's work could be considered a model to actually be emulated by other American historians. YIVO's historical articles, quote, reach back to the style of the life of the whole people, a concentration on social history towards which significantly American historians have been groping for in the past few decades, and which now YIVO is showing in much greater adeptness than most other American scholars. So Handlin's final paragraph is worth sharing. Quote, the Eastern European Jew had a broad tradition rooted in Talmudic discipline, concern with problems that now form the basis of social studies. That concern was unformulated in modern conceptual categories and unscientific in terms of modern methods, but rich in its concentration upon the reality of the individual and society and upon the concreteness of phenomena in their context. The scholars of YIVO can perform a valuable service by preserving in their work a measure of continuity with that tradition. Now, Handlin and Konvitz, it's worthwhile to think of them as commentators on the birth of the annual, specifically and on YIVO in post-World War II America more generally, and on the profile of American Jewry as a post-war people. Handlin, like the men, mostly, who would become the rising generation of American Jewish historians, was the child of immigrants, a product of the old and dying immigrant neighborhoods, which were in the process of being emptied out as American Jews were making their way to their suburban homes. Actually, it was not their first set of suburban homes. Among the first Jews to be tenured at Harvard, and indeed the first professor in the history department, he was a first-generation college. He had been a first-generation college student, he had been a first-generation college student. He had identified his subject matter in the emerging field of social history with immigration and ethnic community formation as his niche at that point. In fact, he had already published Boston's Immigrants, a landmark study of Irish American history. But his Jewish intellectual and personal interests were always there. He wrote often for commentary, would in 1954 author a single volume of American Jewish history with perhaps an unfortunate title called Adventures in Freedom. We don't know if the publisher pushed him to using that term. He would oversee the 1954 conference, which called for the professionalization of the field of American Jewish history. He trained some important scholars in the field, most notably Moses Rishin. Handlin would serve as the president of the American Jewish Historical Society, and more, but he never defined himself as an American Jewish historian. He was an ancillary member of the field. He was a voice, but not a kind of insider practitioner. Konvitz, fascinating figure. He had been born in Ottoman Palestine. He was the son of Rabbi Yaakov David Vilkovsky, the Ridbaz, a figure in American Orthodoxy. Konvitz trained in law and philosophy, associated as a student, and then as a longtime faculty member at Cornell. His intellectual and political interests were broad, including labor, human rights, civil liberties. It's a word he actually coined, among others. But despite not being in the field of Jewish history, he would help found Cornell's program in Jewish studies, and his bibliography includes numerous books on Jews, Judaism, American Jewish history, and striving towards showing the compatibility of Judaism to American life. His bibliography, American Life. Now, both of these scholars had high hopes for YIVO to address educated American Jews and to tap into those issues and experiences which speak to them. So I want to look at that first volume of the annual, which both Konvitz and Handlin reviewed. I want to look ahead from that first volume, that volume which they gave their well wishes and optimistic predictions, and to ask what over the course of the next 2 decades or so would the YIVO annual cover. So I'm going to look at a period from 1946 to 1974, partly because I got an excellent list of all the articles that were in the annual. And also the 1970s is a very important moment in time. In the sociology of knowledge, it takes off as the full-blown beginning of the field of ethnic studies, the integration of ethnic studies into the academy. And in the field of American Jewish history, any number of books of the 1970s became classic landmark studies, which spoke as much to American historians as to Jewish historians. And here's certainly Arthur Gorin's book on the Kahila, Deborah Dash Moore's book, and I'm embarrassed to say my own, on Jews and blacks in the early part of the 20th century. So most trenchantly, the 1970s, where I'm going to end this kind of travelogue of the articles in the annual, this decade corresponds to how American historians have bracketed off the end of the post-war period, a period obviously that has a clear start, the end of World War I, but an ambiguous ending. But certainly the 1970s are delineated as a moment in time when deindustrialization, the failure, the military loss of the United States in Vietnam, the heated discourse about shortages in America's basic resources drove political and social trends in ways that had nothing to do with the war, and hence the end of post-war as a meaningful category. So in those years, what did YIVO Annual publish? How did it live up to the predictions and hopes made in that 1946 moment? So over the course of those years, from 1946 until 1974, only 3 articles in the annual took their theme from something outside of the United States. Okay, it was an American journal, and even those 3 articles, which were European-centered, were really about America, in as much as there was one article about the image of America in the novels of the Yiddish writer Isaac Mayer Dick, and the other 2 explored the immigration specifically of Galician and Romanian Jews to the United States. These latter 2 importantly broke down the idea of Eastern Europe as a singular entity and rather asserted that the specificity of place need to be understood to come to terms with the emigration. But the goal or the end point of those articles was the fact that these were people going to the United States. These were Jews going to the United States. It is notable, looking at the U.S. focus, that only 2 scholars of American Jewish history or trained in of American Jewish history would actually publish in the YIVO Annual, again, between 1946 and 1974, and these were Arthur Gorin and Robert Rockaway. So no other American Jewish historians, at least those of us in our stable, they would publish after 1974, but not before 1974. There were 2 pieces only in that, again, almost 20 years, that moved out of the strictly Jewish zone, but looked at the psychological and social development of other Americans, okay, namely one article on Native American children living on reservations, okay, and how they constructed their social psychological personae, although the article certainly posited that in relationship to data and observation about Jewish children. And there was one article about the maintenance of immigrant languages, not just Yiddish. So those are the only 2 that actually went beyond the Jewish zone. Language in general, Yiddish or other, had actually very little prominence in the annual. There were only 2 articles that were about Yiddish, and one was methodological in focus. There was no article about the Holocaust. There was no article about Israel or Zionism. No article which included the word folklore, which is really notable given how much YIVO in its formative period took folklore as one of its kind of pillars of concern. There was only one article on religion. Okay, and as such, one might say that there was a clear bracketing of certain concerns that were of interest well beyond YIVO. The paucity of religion is worth pondering and likely reflected the distance between YIVO and the world, at least in America, of organized Judaism as a religious system. Ironically, this was a period that was the high point of Jewish membership, American Jewish membership in synagogues. And it, in fact, 1946 is often seen as the beginning of the great religious revival in America and the synagogue building boom, when synagogue memberships mushroomed. Among the historical pieces, and I'll come to that very quickly, there was only one, again, which had to do with a religious figure, and it was the Rabbi Max Lilienthal. But it wasn't about Lilienthal as a rabbi or an architect of Reform Judaism, but as an educator. And education had an important role in the YIVO annuals of those years. Literature did a little better. There were 6 articles, again, from 46 to 74 on literature, but 2 of those focused actually on how non-Jewish writers viewed the Jews, one of which was about Faulkner. Okay, so other than everything, I've given 1 or 2 examples of what they did, or counted 1 or 2. The bulk of the articles were in the 2 fields of social psychology and history, and these became YIVO's métier in these decades. So as to social psychology, over 20 articles pondered the Jewish problem in terms of how Jews in particular settings fit in, both how they lived in the present and how they made sense of themselves as Jews in particular places where non-Jews far outnumbered them. Notably, there were no articles on there was only 1 article on anti-Semitism. But many, and this was on anti-Semitism in the 1930s in St. Louis, but most of the social psychology articles made a point of the existence of some kind of anti-Jewish feeling hovering around the Jewish world, be it in the American military, which was one of the articles, and at Yale University, which was another article, and how Jews navigated that. So clearly these articles focused on the disjunction between Jews and other Americans in multiple ways as Jews went through their American lives. Notably, their American lives. Now, history was the single largest part of the YIVO annuals. Just under 3 dozen articles fit the category of historical analysis, whether focusing on a particular moment in the past and examined in the context of its time period and its place, or articles which took a longer arc, for example, Jewish education, and looked at it, how did it change in Pittsburgh from 1862 to 1932, grappling with evolution and transformations. Now, the historical articles deserve a very brief, I'm told that, breakdown, and to see how it defined the lives of the Jewish people. Okay, first, it is, as Handlin had commented, even from 1946 till 74, there were no articles about Jews in the American state. Okay, there were no articles on Jews in American politics. There were articles, quite a few articles, on Jews' involvement in international concerns about Jews abroad in distress, okay, at various international gatherings, but not about Jewish politics in America. The articles on Jewish immigration, there were articles on Jewish immigration, Jewish education, particularly community studies, not particularly focused on New York, but Chicago, Albany, Pittsburgh, Detroit, and one indeed on Montana, demonstrating, as these authors saw, the breadth of Jewish life in America. Rudolf Glans, I think a fascinating figure who didn't come up in the earlier talk and was very much a YIVO insider, wrote, in fact, an article on the spread of Jewish communities before the Civil War. But for the most part, these were articles about the Jewish communities, how they changed over time in a variety of places. There was little on the great East European Jewish migration and its New York locus. It's very interesting how that is going to change after the 1970s. And again, in this period up to 1974, there was only one article which mentioned and looked at in any depth, and looked at all, to the Jewish Daily Forward, which would later become the holy grail of Jewish historical scholars, of American Jewish historical historians. And this was an article written by Tamara Haraven, a social historian. Probably very few people here will know her other than maybe Deborah and myself, who went on to write important works about the textile workers of New Hampshire, none of whom were Jewish. So all of this is going to change in the 1970s, and perhaps there'll be some questions about how and why it changed. But I would like to just conclude by saying that, for the most part, looking at the arc of those 20 years, that the hopeful predictions enunciated by Konvitz and Handlin were well borne out, and the journal became a lively and important organ, but so profoundly and thoroughly American-focused. Thank you.
Thank you, Hasia. We've just heard two fascinating lectures. We're about to hear a third. The introduction...
They can read it. Just let's
Actually, the introduction mentions Naomi's fourth book. It doesn't mention her first three. They are A Marriage Made in Heaven, The Sexual Politics of Hebrew and Yiddish, written in a long time ago. More recently, Faithful Renderings, Jewish-Christian Difference and the Politics of Translation. The Marriage Plot, or How Jews Fell in Love and with Literature. And she's also the author of an article, Gender and the Remaking of Modern Jewry in the Cambridge History of Judaism, edited by Mitchell Hart and Tony Michels. Naomi Seidman.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm just really conscious of us being so... there we go. Okay, hi. First of all, just a really quick thank you to Sam for chairing the panel, to Alex and to Julia for inviting me, to Stephanie for downloading various things for me. Maybe I should say people's last names: Stephanie Halperin, Alex Weiser, Julia Rothkopf, Sam Norich. And I think we're all grateful to Kalman and Cecile for doing the real spade work of understanding what YIVO. I mean, Kalman's book is still forthcoming, but he let me read chapters of it, so I'm very grateful. I know everyone's around here, but I don't see him. So by all accounts, the peak of, is there a way that I could see is there someone here running this? I don't have the PowerPoint in front of me, but I'll just keep going and wait for somebody to show up. By all accounts, the peak of Max Weinreich's engagement with psychoanalysis was the 1930s. The decade began with Freud's consent to join the honorary board of trustees of YIVO, launching a regular correspondence between the men. Psychoanalysis was among the methods. I'm sorry, I'm also, thank you. Is there a way I could see what I'm looking at there? Thank you, thank you. Okay, psychoanalysis was among the methods that Weinreich mobilized in the youth research he undertook during those years, culminating in Der Weg zu unserer Jugend. During this period, as Freud's authorized Yiddish translator, Weinreich began work on the 6th volume, there we go, on the 6th volume rendering of introductory lectures on psychoanalysis. He also regularly explained Freud's ideas for a Yiddish audience. Let's see, where's that? I'm sorry, I'm just very bad at this little clicking thing. Okay, sorry. He wrote articles on psychoanalysis in the popular press. He published an introduction to the field in 1937 at YIVO. He taught seminars on psychoanalysis. In other words, Weinreich's relationship with psychoanalysis was multifaceted, and the line between his explanations of Freud and his own ideas about the psyche is not always easy to parse. Psychoanalysis was certainly transformed in being written from right to left rather than left to right, and in understanding Vilna rather than Vienna. As should already be clear, this was a mutual engagement. Freud wrote a respectful letter that served as a preface to the Rheinfehr. At a meeting in November 1938 with YIVO representatives in London, Freud went so far as to refer to the work being done in Vilna as the Jewish branch of the science, meaning psychoanalysis. And in one of his last letters to Weinreich in 1938, Freud spoke of their enterprises as endangered by the same threat, comparing both himself and Weinreich to the founder of Rabbinic Judaism, Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who escaped the besieged city of Jerusalem and negotiated with the Roman emperor to allow him to create a rabbinic academy in exile. In this sense, Freud provided a prophetic comment on the topic of this conference, a midrashic commentary on what it meant to carry one's store of Torah to a place of refuge amidst a cosmic catastrophe. On the face of things, Freud's engagement with Weinreich's, you talk about Freud, just Freudian slip after Freudian slip. On the face of things, Weinreich's engagement with Freud came to an end with Freud's death, the outbreak of the Second World War, and the removal of YIVO to New York. I found no evidence that Weinreich taught psychoanalysis in the United States, nor did he undertake a full-fledged study of American Jews along the lines of Der Weg zu unserer Jugend. The clearest sign of a break with Freud was that Weinreich abandoned his translation of the introductory lectures at its midpoint in tacit recognition that the audience for such a work no longer existed. Turning his attention from psychoanalysis, Weinreich devoted his energies to rebuilding YIVO on American soil, commemorating Eastern European Jewish life and experience, and completing his masterwork, The History of the Yiddish Language. The autobiography contest of the 1930s had focused on youth between 18 and 22, but in New York, the contest focused on immigrants, and the average autobiographer was 60 years old. In this environment, Weinreich's earlier work on Jewish adolescence had held little sway. Mordechai Schechter, in his study of Weinreich's Freud translation, reports that Weinreich's coinages were initially received as masterful. For instance, Weinreich replaced the inappropriate Deutschmarisms, we could call them Bewusstsein and Unbewusstsein, for the conscious and unconscious, with the archaisms Wissigkeit and Unwissigkeit. But the interruption of the Holocaust halted the reception of that terminology, while Uriel Weinreich's dictionary lists both Wissigkeit and Bewusstsein for the conscious. Other writers simply reverted to the older term Bewusstsein. Let me see what I have here. Yes, there is. And yet, Freud reminds us that nothing is truly forgotten. The past lives within us. And in fact, psychoanalysis never completely disappeared from Weinreich's thought. Even the terminology resurfaced in unexpected places. The term he used in the interwar period to describe the Jewish psyche was pressed into service in the history of the Yiddish language to describe a distinctive sociolinguistic feature of Yiddish language uses, the component consciousness of its speakers. Komponentenwissigkeit, so the term Wissigkeit is used sociolinguistically, by which he meant their ability to recognize which components of the language they were using, German, Lashon Kodesh, Slavic. Der Weg used Freud's theory of the layered psyche to describe the psychic structure of the Jewish collective. The history of the Yiddish language borrowed the same terminology to account for the distinctive features of a speech community. Yiddish was not simply a Schmelzsprach, a fusion language, a feature common to many, if not all, languages. What distinguished Yiddish was rather the psychic character of this feature, the fact that Yiddish speakers were conscious of the checkered character of the language they spoke, a feature generally unconscious, but no less operative for speakers of other languages. But beyond this repurposed term, did psychoanalysis just disappear from Weinreich's consciousness or YIVO's intellectual horizons in American exile? Or perhaps it went underground, as historians suggest is the case for the psychoanalytic scene in interwar Poland, a scene in which Weinreich participated, which was repressed during the communist era, but nevertheless continued to operate despite and through this repression, as unconscious currents do within each individual. The psychoanalytic perspective on Jewish culture that he forged in Vilna stayed with Weinreich in New York, but it took on a different aspect. Researchers will not find this worldview in academic monographs. It expressed itself largely in oral remarks he made about American Jews and their relation to YIVO. Nevertheless, from his arrival in New York to the very end of his life, Weinreich took a psychoanalytic perspective on his central mission, rebuilding YIVO in America. If so, psychoanalysis was crucial to his time in America, perhaps even more so than in Vilna. And here's a quote. Oh, sorry, I'm a little behind on my slides. The Israeli literary critic Don Miron relates that in their last conversation before Weinreich's death, Weinreich described YIVO as a kind of embodied psychic structure. I don't know about you Israelis, he said to Miron, but by now I know my American Jews, young ones included. If American Jews still dream as a group, Yiddish is the language they speak in their dreams. It is still the idiom of their collective unconscious. For their personality to become whole, they, at least some of them, will have to go back to Yiddish someday. And there we shall be, waiting for them down in the Yiddish cellar with a strong torchlight in our hands. If somebody will have to spell out for them the content of their dreams, to elucidate the vision they saw with bleary eyes. And we, because we made Yiddish Wissenschaft the thing we live and die for, will be able to throw light and heal. 3 speeches Weinreich delivered in 44 and 45 lend substance to Miron's memory and reveal that Weinreich was developing this understanding of American Jews while the war still raged. The most basic psychoanalytic tool he used was a Freudian hermeneutic of suspicion, wielded with caustic wit. What seemed most apparent about American Jews, what American Jews reported about themselves with the utmost confidence, generally concealed a nearly opposite thought, wish, or fear. To understand what YIVO was in America, to understand what YIVO was to America, it was necessary to clear the ground of the misconceptions, this is his favorite term, the banalities of the discourse of rich, atomized, satisfied American Jews. Those were scare quotes. In relation to YIVO and Yiddish, and to discern what was concealed behind these assertions. American Jews, in their self-regard, considered themselves to be saving Yiddish or inheriting the treasures of YIVO's work, a banal truism as absurd as the notion that a Balabatisha brother would take over the intellectual production of his brother, the Rosh Hashiva. American Jews considered it their duty to send their children to Jewish schools, even if they were thereby sacrificing the best interests of Sadie or Irving. They made a point of letting Weinreich know that they considered a Jewish organization devoted to the study of Eastern European Jews a reversion to the ghetto. Yiddish was the language of poor people, old people, of grüne Immigranten. Weinreich responded to these provocations, first of all, by correcting misconceptions. Yiddish was not just green, it comprised all the colors of the rainbow. To be in a Jewish ghetto was a spiritual condition, and more recently, a heroic stance that Americans could only dream of achieving. Yiddish was the property not only of immigrants and the old, but also, perhaps especially, of the young. It was not YIVO that was provincial, but rather American Jews, ignorant as they were of what Judaism could be beyond the stereotypes they absorbed from their non-Jewish environment. But he wasn't only concerned with correcting the record. The question was why American Jews were so persuaded of these untruths. In this regard, Weinreich made the argument that their banalities allowed them to avoid recognizing the truth about YIVO in its American Jewish context. YIVO, despite the thick accents of so many of its leading figures, its poverty and dislocation, was not a supplicant to its potential or actual American Jewish donors. American Jewish condescension was a thin disguise over a destabilizing awareness that it was the American Jewish community that was impoverished and needy in a psychological, if not material sense. This was why supporting YIVO by reading its publications or attending lectures or enrolling in a graduate program was not an act of philanthropy or solidarity with a needy relative, but rather a step toward psychic healing and mental health, even if American Jews couldn't see that. It was in fact part of YIVO's function to make American Jewish descendants of the great civilization of Jewish Eastern Europe aware of this unconscious mechanism. Reluctantly speaking in English to the graduating class of the Baltimore Hebrew College in June 1945, Weinreich explained that it was a mistake for American Jewry, a mistake that marked them, in fact, as American, to assume that group interests and the individual interests were at odds, that donating to Jewish causes or asserting one's Jewish identity or sending one's children to Jewish schools was a sacrifice made for the greater good, a pious, if condescending gesture toward one's parents and the past. Weinreich's reversal of the American Eastern European Jewish hierarchy drew on the psychoanalytic notion of the layered character of the psyche, a structure that exposed anxieties and desires concealed behind American Jewish bluster, ignorance, and self-satisfaction. But Weinreich's use of the stratified psyche also corrected for Freud's persistent focus on the individual or nuclear family, a focus Weinreich saw as deriving from the deracinated, atomized Jewish identities shared by German-speaking and English-speaking Jews. By contrast, Weinreich argued that American Jews were unaware of how significantly their psyches were shaped by Jewish culture and history, limited as they were in associating Jewishness with family, the synagogue, and a few abstract ideas. Non-Jewish misunderstandings of Jews flowed into the vacuum with no Jewish compensation available to put up any resistance. Compensation is perhaps the most persistent term in Weinreich's psychological toolkit, mobilized to explain the miseries of both Polish Jewish adolescents and the Jewish Americans he addressed later. Weinreich believed that Jewish culture functioned as a form of compensation for the ego blow of anti-Semitism. As he clarified in Baltimore, all children require such compensation to make up for their dependency and vulnerability, but Jewish children require stronger medicine given their social vulnerabilities. He stressed that compensatory mechanisms were psychic operations drawing on fantasy and desire and untethered from reality. And by the compensatory mechanism of Jewish culture, he meant the Jewish religion, but also Jewish nationalism, and attachment to the idea that all the people who got Nobel Prizes were Jewish, which Jonathan mentioned today. He mentions it too. Despite the overlap between Weinreich's analysis of Polish Jewish adolescents and American Jews, there's a real difference between how those mechanisms functioned. Weinreich took it for granted that Polish Jewry were indeed a persecuted minority, while acknowledging the imaginary character of the compensations by which they met this condition. For American Jews, both the nature and degree of their vulnerability to anti-Semitism and the way they mobilized or failed to find forms of psychic compensation were uncertain, imaginary, and perhaps illusory. Weinreich thus deliberately avoided taking a stand on the persistent question, persisting indeed to our own day, of the gravity and danger posed to American Jews of American anti-Semitism. Nor did he participate in ongoing discussions of what Jews could do about this anti-Semitism or what explained it. What mattered from his perspective and what could be accomplished by Jewish educators and activists was rather the psychic consequences of anti-Semitism, imaginary or real. Consequences Weinreich felt had been neglected by American Jewish public discourse. Weinreich made this point even more forcefully when speaking in Yiddish. Here he is talking about anti-Semitism. In his opening remarks at the 19th annual YIVO conference, 80 years ago, not today, in January, Weinreich cited a composition by a student at a local Jewish school about a Jewish child with no siblings who lived in a Christian neighborhood. When his mother told him to go out and play, he said that the Christian children were beating him up and begged her to move the family to a different neighborhood. There, the Jewish child was finally happy with many Jewish friends. Weinreich openly doubted that the composition should be taken as straightforward autobiography, bracketing the question of how much anti-Semitic bullying a child might actually encounter, or whether the composition should be taken as a, quote, a dark prophecy of horrors yet to come. Weinreich suggested that it should be read not as realism, but rather as surrealism, borrowing the term from modern art. That's a quote from him. The child was expressing not facts, and not even only fears, but also an unconscious longing for a lost Jewish intimacy. Anti-Semitism was the very real and persistent context for the adolescents Weinreich studied in the 1930s. In the 1940s, by contrast, Weinreich bracketed the question of whether Jews were justified in fearing anti-Semitism in favor of taking these fears as symptoms of more deeply buried truths. There's another related difference in Weinreich's thinking about the Jewish psyche in these two contexts. Perhaps surprisingly, YIVO is more directly implicated in Weinreich's thinking about compensation in the American Jewish context than it was in Poland, where it was just one of the phenomena bolstering Jewish collectivity against the psychic wounds of anti-Semitism. These blows might be more moderate or even questionable in America, but there were also far fewer forms of compensation, and it was left to YIVO to fill that gaping void. It was true that in Baltimore, Weinreich more tactfully named Jewish education in general as just such a bulwark. But in his addresses to the YIVO conferences in 1944 and 1945, it was YIVO that was charged almost single-handedly with the role of healing the American Jewish psyche. It was YIVO that could provide the knowledge to counter internalized anti-Semitism. YIVO that provided the intimacy that could salve Jewish loneliness. In Der Weg, Weinreich had described a range of psychic compensations that could salve Jewish wounds through ethnic narcissism. But YIVO provided healing not through apologetics or fantasies, but more rigorously through knowledge, scientifically gleaned and delivered. YIVO replaced the fantasy that God had chosen the Jewish people, or that a Messiah would redeem them, or that a homeland would solve their problems, or the pride in the percentage of Nobel Prize winners were Jews. This is all quoting Weinreich, with knowledge of Jewish history and research into Jewish lifeways offered under the sign of science. In 1944, at the annual YIVO conference, Weinreich was even more explicit in linking YIVO's role in America with Freud's understanding of how psychoanalysis worked. Reminding his audience of Freud's service to YIVO, Weinreich explained that psychoanalysis should be credited with the recognition that the only way to master unconscious psychic energies is to recognize them, und erkennen heißt wissen. Recognizing them means knowing them. This brief phrase is a kind of Yiddish counterpart to Freud's famous summary of how psychoanalysis works, where id was, their ego shall be. Or to put it differently, where yid was, their YIVO shall be. In translating Freud's terms, Weinreich's understanding of how an individual comes to know his unconscious desires is understood through the academic research being undertaken at YIVO, cementing the connection between self-knowledge and academic research by insisting that no firm line could be drawn between the psyche of any Jewish individual and the collectivist Jewish psyche, which carried on its work underground, as it were. However ignorant American Jews of Eastern European descent were of their history or of Yiddish, this knowledge was at once foreign and highly, deeply intimate, like the unconscious. The young Jew who takes a class at YIVO, I'm sorry, That's not what I was looking for, but okay. The young Jew takes a class at YIVO, even if they've never been to Poland, perhaps especially if they've never been to Poland, was in Weinreich's view coming back to themselves. But knowledge alone couldn't heal what Weinreich called the split consciousness of Jewish Americans. What was needed was knowledge accompanied by prestige. As he pointed out in 1944, tens of thousands of young men and women in New York could understand or even speak Yiddish. The problem wasn't that Yiddish was foreign to American Jews, but that man halt nicht davon. No one valued Yiddish or Yiddishkeit. For Weinreich, prestige wasn't a measurable entity, a kind of capital to amass. Like the inchoate anxieties it helped alleviate, prestige was primarily a psychic illusion, as suggested by the long associations that he mentioned with the magician's sleight of hand and hypnotic power. Prestige took many forms and had many functions. YIVO's prestigious address and the handsome Yiddish sign hanging outside the 535 West 123rd smooth over painful associations of Yiddish with Hester Street, a French cultural institution in New York that hosted a course in French literature, provided the satisfaction of, as Weinreich put it, "Bakumen a Herrscher von a Goy." Other pathways provided other satisfactions. When a son hears about YIVO, not from his father, the tailor, but from his Columbia professor, Weinreich said, that's a special kind of prestige. And when his father hears about YIVO, not from the Yiddish paper, but from his son, the college student, ist das weitere Schule, even better. For Weinreich, acquiring prestige for YIVO was more than a strategy for institutional survival. Even if in its devastation and displacement, YIVO's prestige lent status to all who touched and were touched by it, prestige capable of healing the rift between old and new, assimilated and knowledgeable Jews, immigrant parents, and their American children. YIVO's role as a repository of the artifacts of a destroyed world did not thereby render it a dusty, irrelevant museum. Freud famously described the unconscious as a buried site, a rune, the site of an apparently forgotten trauma. Sorry, here we go. In Weinreich's retelling, which is also an echo of Rabbi Yochanan and the besieged Jerusalem, this metaphor regains its historical concreteness to encompass actual buildings, a building present now, and the ruin it displaces and bears witness to. YIVO, in Weinreich's thought, became the Jewish psyche in what was visible and in what the visible building occluded, in its brokenness or in trauma and its healing. Not in the banal sense of a triumphal survival, but both at once, inextricably, as it were, in a single building, a single psyche. Boy, this is the least responsive little machine I have ever held. This is like me with the remote control in my hotel room this morning. Oh, wait, it's moving. It's just not on my... I'm sorry, it's just not here. I am so sorry. There it is. Phew. This is such a hard job. In this metaphor, Freud is revived and brought back to his roots. In this metaphor, psychoanalysis went from one tool among many in Weinreich's estimable toolkit into the implicit, essential meaning of YIVO. Psychoanalysis didn't have to be taught at YIVO. Lectures on Yiddish grammar or Ashkenazic folklore or history would do the work just as well. So, was Weinreich right about the American Jewish psyche? When I stood in that group of students at this Yiddish summer program in 1991, was it myself that I was seeking or finding? Was he right about what YIVO meant or continues to mean, even now at this conference on this prestigious stage? If he was, why didn't he write an American Jewish counterpart to Der Weg zu unserer Jugend? Yes, he had other pressing commitments, other projects, but to play the role of psychoanalyst for a moment, perhaps there are other factors working beneath the surface. Weinreich introduced der Weg by saying that he scarcely understood the youth that he was studying, given the rapid developments of his time, which had opened up a larger than usual generation gap between adults and adolescents. But surely a greater chasm separated him from American Jews. Weinreich understood that anti-Semitism occupied a peculiar place in the American Jewish psyche, wavering between stark realities and subjective phantasms. But he might have said more, it seems to me, about the uses American Jews made and make of anti-Semitism, which contributes to its psychic instability. More to the point, if his primary sources should be understood as serialistic psychic expressions rather than accurate portrayals of American Jewish life, YIVO and Weinreich were also implicated in this play of fantasy, projection, and transference in the relationships. It's surely no accident that his reflections on prestige were also the occasions for some of Weinreich's most intimate, emotional, and revealing remarks about what it meant to lack prestige. He tells the story of the embassy official processing his application for American visa who expressed skepticism that the words Yiddish and scientific might belong in the same title. He scornfully quotes a patronizing American donor who suggested that YIVO translate the word Yiddish as Jewish for your own good, expresses his rage at those who use the term ghetto Jew as a pejorative. Whose wounds was YIVO healing exactly? Who was lonelier, the 13-year-old Yiddish student or the one who interpreted his words, who heard the nostalgia in them, the call for a lost collective life? If Weinreich did not produce a finished study of the American Jewish psyche, perhaps that was because the study would have been interminable, a hall of mirrors that caught up the researcher and the institution he was building, a repository for the collective dreams, not only of American Jews, but also of its immigrant researchers. Thank you.
Shkoyach. With your permission and with the permission of the Balabatim, I hope we can take a couple of questions. We're running a bit past the schedule, but these really extraordinary talks really demand some kind of audience reaction. Comments, questions? Good. There being none, permit me to close with the following. I began with words of praise. I'd like to conclude with words of regret. We've been treated and will be treated for the rest of the day to several extraordinary lectures focused mainly on the first decades of YIVO's American 85 years. That's as it should be. It's welcome, it's appreciated. Those were, in fact, the formative years of YIVO in America. And it's entirely right that this conference should focus on the three Weinreich decades in America and on the period up through the 1960s and 70s. But I regret that this conference didn't have one additional day that would focus on the last few decades of YIVO's 100 years. Maybe in a sequel to this conference, we can look forward at the 101st anniversary of YIVO, or the 105th, or the 110th, to as engaging and as incisive a treatment as we've been hearing and will hear, I expect, in the rest of today, of the first decades in America. For my part, I would just mention the names of my colleagues who did the work of YIVO in the 1980s and early 90s. Not only people like Dina Abramovich, Marek Webb, Raj Schwartz, Fruma Maurer, Il Tulangio, Zachary Baker, who became chief librarian after Dina, to historians Yeshaya Trunk, Shlomo Noble, Lucian Dobroshitsky, to assistants like Alicia Svigals, Naomi Utevsky, Miriam Holmes, others that you may remember, even to Jesus, whose last name Rosario, thank you. I knew there'd be somebody who would remember that. Or Herbert, whose last name I also forget. Thank you. That's YIVO lives. Thank you.